I want to, first of all, thank our friends and colleagues, Senator Harkin and Senator Brown, and so many of the other members, colleagues here, for raising the sense of conscience on the floor of the United States Senate, and to pay tribute to the extraordinary leadership of the men and women of faith over the period of these recent years in reminding all Americans that increasing the minimum wage is basically a moral issue. It's a moral issue. We have a lot of diversity in our country of different faiths, but all of them are unified about not exploiting the poor and the neediest among us. All of these men and women of faith have spoken eloquently here in the hearings and in town halls, on village greens, in small villages all across this country about the issue of fairness and the moral issue which is raised when we talk about the minimum wage. This is an issue just about a paycheck, but these men and women of faith understand that it ought to be a just paycheck. They know that this is a family issue because it involves women and children. They understand it's a children's issue. 6 million children will be benefited with this increase in the minimum wage, with all of that means in terms of their hopes and dreams and being a part of the promise of America. We are enormously grateful to them for their willingness to be here today and to share their own guidance and their own teachings with us. Today was a very important step forward, but we're not there yet. And we will continue the battle, but we are so welcoming to these men and women of faith to help all of us, not only in Congress, but in America, understand why this issue is so important for our humanity, for our decency, and for our basic position of being Americans. I'd like to ask if Senator Harkin and Senator Brown would say a brief word, and then I'll recognize Jim Morris.
First of all, I want to thank Senator Kennedy for his leadership. I've now been privileged to serve on his committee for 21 years now. And I think the 87 votes that we just had here on cloture on this is a testament to his doggedness and his refusal to ever give up in his pursuit of fairness and more justice for American workers. I think Senator Kennedy's been on this. Now, this one, in terms of raising the minimum wage, well, for about the last 10 years. And he's never given up. And every year it keeps coming back and back and back. And so I just want to thank Senator Kennedy for being a leader on this issue and for his dogged persistence in never giving up. And we're going to get this accomplished, I'm sure, this year. I thank Reverend Wallace for being here, Reverend Bob Edgar, my longtime friend and former colleague, Reverend David, Rabbi David Saperstein, not Reverend, but Rabbi David Saperstein, another longtime friend, Reverend Toon, for being with us here today. I think what Senator Kennedy said is important. We think about this in economic terms and about the unfairness of people in a poverty wage. You know, no one in America who goes to work every day and works hard ought to have an income that keeps them in poverty. And I think it was Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. who saw this as a moral issue. In 1966, what he said applies today, 41 years later. He said, "We know of no more crucial civil rights issue facing Congress today than the need to increase the federal minimum wage and extend its coverage. A living wage should be the right of all working Americans." And I think that's what we're about here, is to not only raise the minimum wage, but to hopefully begin a process of making it a right, a living wage being a right of all Americans. And I think, I want to thank the men who are here today with us, leaders of the faith community in different religions, for their support of this for so many years. It is an economic issue, but it's also, I think, a deeply moral and ethical issue. How can we call ourselves Americans? How can we call ourselves adherents to our Constitution and our Bill of Rights if we keep people working and living in poverty? So hopefully this is our first step in the process of making this a right of all working Americans.
Senator Brown, Sherrod Brown, Ohio.
Thank you. I've had the pleasure of being on Senator Kennedy's committee for 21 days. I'm thrilled. So, thank you. And I've watched both Senator Harkin and Senator Kennedy, and they're always their fight and crusade for economic justice and social justice and never giving up. And so admire that persistence. Reverend Toon, Rabbi Saperstein, thank you. Reverend Wallace and Reverend Edgar, thank you all for standing together. A couple of years ago, Jim Wallace and Reverend Bob Griswold, the head of the Episcopal Church, presented Congress a document, as many of you recall, that proved to be both practical and prophetic. The basic tenets were that budgets are moral documents and that our values represented by how we craft those documents. And this is one example where people of faith, people in the labor movement, people who advocate for children, people who are in the civil rights movement, people who care overall about social and economic justice have stepped forward and done the right thing, and this is one major step we're taking today. Dr. King in 1963 said equality means dignity, and dignity demands a paycheck that lasts through the end of the week. And I think today, when this is only one small step, as Senator Kennedy said on the floor, talking about earned income tax credit, talking about overtime, talking about prevailing wage, all that we need to do to move this country forward. We've seen a Congress that for 10 years has refused to raise the minimum wage, yet voted itself 6 pay increases. There are people that make minimum wage, make less than $11,000 a year, while some CEOs in this country make more than $11,000 an hour, and those days are finally behind us. People who fought against this minimum wage, people who vote against this minimum wage, are really, it stood in the House chamber and Senate chamber and have done that, are really saying to the chambermaid at a Cleveland hotel, or saying to a farm worker outside Toledo, and a janitor in Lima, are saying that those people aren't worth a fraction of what we're worth. And that's just morally wrong and reprehensible. Today is the first step in increasing minimum wage and standing up for fellow men and women in our society.
Jim Wallace, who is the President and Executive Director of Sojourn. Jim, thank you.
Well, this is a good vote. But as Senator Kennedy already said, it's the beginning. We've got a long way to go. It is a political fact now that faith communities across the board very widely are in favor of increasing this minimum wage. But why is that? What's the theological foundation behind that? We don't just do politics. We do politics because of our faith. So let me just share a story. I was at Davos, the World Economic Forum. And even at Davos, they're dealing with this issue. I was asked to address a group called "Should We Despair of Our Disparities?" And so I told them about a very, very hot topic at Davos called biblical archaeology. And I'll share that today. This is very relevant to this. When the biblical archaeologists dig down the ruins of ancient Israel, they find periods where there was a relative equality. There were no great houses and small shacks, not a sameness, but prosperity was being shared. During those times, there were no prophets. No Isaiah, no Micah, no Amos. When they dig down, find other periods of time where there were great, huge shack, mansions and small shacks, and the artifacts of life showed a great gap between the people. That's when the prophets rise up to thunder the judgment and justice of God, which means that God hates inequality. That's our theological foundation. God hates inequality. What does the Bible say about minimum wage? Well, the prophet Isaiah said, "My chosen shall long enjoy the work of their hands. They shall not labor in vain." James, who was the sibling of Jesus, he probably knew what his brother thought about things pretty well, said, "Listen, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord." There were 6 states with referenda, and I want to commend the Let Justice Roll campaign, the National Council Churches, Paul Sherry, the kind of lion behind all that. we were happy to join in that. And we found that Americans agree with us. Americans think that if you work hard full-time, you shouldn't be poor. And 9.2 million American families are. There's somebody in the household who works hard full-time and they're raising their kids in poverty. That's wrong. It's against our theology. It's also un-American. What's at risk here is a genuine opportunity society. Well, it's a fraud, I would say, when the average CEO of Standard & Poor's 500 company makes $13.5 million in total compensation in 2005, while the minimum wage worker made $10,700. Over the last 30 years ago, CEOs made 30 times what their average workers make, 30 years ago. Japan, Germany are still about that ratio. Now, in America, 30 years later, it's 400 to 1, which means the average worker has to work a whole year to make what his boss makes in one day. This is wrong. It's an injustice. It's a theological issue. The House has acted, and now the Senate has decided to act, and I think this is crucial for us. And when, not if, when the minimum wage is passed, we must then take the next step needed to guarantee that work works in America, provide for families success and security. Those who work responsibly should have a living family income, a combination of family earnings, supports for transportation, health care, nutrition, child care, education, housing. Tax policies should reward work and family stability. Ownership and job creation is critical. Work has to work in America. It doesn't right now. It has to work. Minimum wage is simply the down payment on social justice. You've made the down payment. Now it's time to do the rest of the work. Thank you.
Reverend Bob right here is General Secretary, National Council of Churches.
I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm particularly delighted in the vote that gives an opportunity for the minimum wage to be lifted. I'm delighted to be here with Senator Kennedy, particularly delighted to also be here with Tom Harkin. Tom and I served back in 1975, 76, 77. The minimum wage today is actually less than what it was in 77, 78, and 79 in terms of buying power. I'm also glad to be here with my other colleagues, Rabbi David Saperstein, Reverend Jim Wallace, who has really brought some passion to the issue of ending the poverty that kills, and Reverend Ramal Toon, who works so hard on justice issues. And I'm especially glad to be here with Paul Sherrod. His name was mentioned. He's hiding over here. But he had 91 organizations lifting the minimum wage in 12 states from 2004 to 2006. And what that meant is it gives an awful lot of Democrats and Republicans, and some who are on the margins on this issue, some strength. Because what the Senate is doing here, what the House has done, kicks in a minimum wage that in fact other places across the country in states and cities has already been met or exceeded. And as my colleague Jim Wallace has said, we've got to lift the minimum wage to a living wage, and I think Kennedy had it right. Senator Kennedy said this is a moral issue. If Hubert Humphrey were here, Hubert would say the moral test of government is what we do to those in the dawn of life, our children, those in the twilight of life, the elderly, and all of those in the shadows of life, the poor, the sick, and the disabled. Those in the shadows are the people who have made our beds in the hotels that we've stayed at, the people who are working in the kitchen, the people who are cleaning the streets, the people who are working in fast food restaurants, who have neither a living wage, they don't have a minimum wage, they don't have health care, they don't have a quality of life. We're here to say this is a moral issue. And as General Secretary of the little National Council of Churches, representing about 100,000 congregations and 45 million Christians, and working closely with the Roman Catholic Church, working closely with our friends in the Jewish and Muslim community, we think it's time for the faithful majority to stand up and see this issue as a moral issue, a core issue for our time. I close with a quote from our former Pope, John Paul. He said, "I dream of a world where none will be so poor, they have nothing to give, and none will be so rich, they have nothing to receive." We've shared with you a letter signed by 1,000 religious leaders. The Let Justice Roll campaign has rolled to this moment. We're going to roll on to make the minimum wage a living wage. Thank you.
David Saperstein, Rabbi Saperstein, Religious Action Center, Reform Judaism.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to be here with my colleagues. They are amongst the real champions of the efforts for social justice in America. I'm honored to be here with these senators. It is not an exaggeration to say that they are amongst the true giants of justice of our generation. To me, Sherrod Brown represents the future of these efforts to transform America for the better. And there have been no two people in my 32 years here in Washington that I've worked with more than Tom Harkin and Ted Kennedy, who have dedicated themselves and done it with skill, passion, and real achievement to make this country a better place. All across America, synagogues and churches have been deeply involved in the battle over the minimum wage. They help lead the efforts in those states that have passed minimum wage increases above what the federal level is at. The people represented in the polls that show overwhelming support are the people in our pews. They are motivated and mobilized by the prophetic vision of what it means to have a fair and just world. We stand here today for the individual who works 52 weeks a year, 40 hours a week, and still finds their family living $5,000 less than the poverty line. We stand here for the millions like her who cannot find respite in their struggles to support those they love. Long before it took on its current National Enquirer type meaning, the word scandal was part of a specifically religious discourse. In its origins, it means offense against God. Even today, the Standard Dictionary definition is an event or episode that offends the moral sensibilities of society. I'm here today to say, with all the conviction and fervor I can muster, that our failure to deal quickly and cleanly with the minimum wage has been a scandal in both the ancient and modern sense of the word. It offends our society's sensibilities, as every poll continues to show, and it is assuredly an offense against God, whose children all of us are. So let us, for God's sake and our own, put an end to this scandal. We're often cynical about politics, but the work of these senators, 87, who voted today, an extraordinary number, to act on the minimum wage shows it can make a difference in the real lives of real people. So let us do more for the 13 million Americans who will benefit from a raise in the minimum wage. Let us do more for the full-time minimum wage workers who bring home nearly 60% of their family's income and support their children on earnings that condemn them to a life of poverty. Let us do more for those struggling to make ends meet, yet because of inflation, year by year have seen their wages devalued since the last increase a decade ago. Let us do more for the workers in the 23 states that do not have a minimum wage above the federal level. Let us do more for the 59% of minimum wage workers who are women, and the disproportionate number of minority workers who are forced to work at a minimum wage. Let us do more for minimum wage workers and all workers and their family, as we did when we last raised the minimum wage. And that created higher rates of employment. It created higher wages. It spurred growth in the total income of all families, not just those who earn the minimum wage. We do not stand here as faith leaders today asking for a collection from the congregation. We do not stand here with senators asking for a government program. We stand here, clergy and public servants, demanding justice in the form of self-sufficiency for America's workers. We stand here in the spirit of Maimonides, who taught that the highest level of charitable justice was to enable someone to stand on their own feet and be able to provide for themselves and their loved ones. And we stand here together to give a call to all the members of Congress to declare a season of justice for the American worker and ensure that our laborers who every day build our nation have the resources they need and the dignity they deserve.
Reverend Toome, CEO of Clergy Strategic Alliances. Reverend Toome, thank you.
First, let me thank Senator Kennedy and Senator Harkin and Senator Brown for calling together this press conference and for all that you do to fight for working families. It's always an honor to stand with giants in the work of prophetic witness and justice advocacy, the likes of Bob Edgar, David Saperstein, Jim Wallace, Paul Sherry, and since I value having a place to live in these cold winter months, I must acknowledge my wife, Reverend Leslie Toome, who works for the National Council of Churches. My name is Reverend Ramal Toone, and I'm here representing Clergy Strategic Alliances and the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, as well as the African American churches in both rural and urban communities that we work with across the country on social justice issues. But not only do I represent those who are fighting to create better communities and better opportunities for their children, I also stand here as someone who was raised in a low-income family by a mother who worked every day with the hope that her dreams, not those that she once had for herself, but her dream that somehow through her hard work, my life would be made better. And for me, that's why raising the minimum wage is such a critical issue. Because in as much as it will give working families and women like my mother a better chance to feed their families by raising the minimum wage, our political leaders will be sending a message that says we are concerned about the needs of all American families, especially those who want to believe that our political process does not just reward the wealthy, but respects the needs of the working class. Now, I've heard people stand behind desks like this and quote the famous words of men and women throughout our great history. But as I prepared to address you today, I thought I should quote someone in my family who is still fighting to overcome poverty. And so I called my cousin Jeanette, who lives in San Francisco, a city where the minimum wage is well over $5.15. And I said to her, hypothetically, if someone gave you $5.15 per hour so that you could somehow feed your son, provide him with clothing, health care, child care, after-school activities, pay rent, as well as your transportation to and from work, if someone said that I will give you $5.15 per hour so that you can do all of this, what would that mean to you? And in her oratorical elegance, she said, well, Reverend Toome, if someone suggested that I could do all of those things you asked me for $5.15 an hour, it would be like giving a whale a tic-tac. And in as much as I found the humor in what she had to say, I realized that raising the minimum wage is not a laughing matter. But the reality is that the decision that our senators make on raising the minimum wage will tell the people in their communities and communities across the country that either they believe in cheap justice that allows them to talk about family values, compassion, and opportunity, or they believe in sacrificial justice that is willing to show humility, grace, and generosity towards others. As people of faith who are called to prophetic witness on behalf of the oppressed, we are asking you not to pay lip service to the needs of working families, but resist the temptation of cheap justice and raise the minimum wage. Raising the minimum wage is the first step among many in giving people the opportunity to believe that perhaps one day they can rise above poverty and give their children a fighting chance to achieve their dreams. Raising the minimum wage will not change the plight of the poor overnight, but it will send a message of hope that says the darkness is not your destiny, and your dreams still have a chance of becoming reality. As a person of faith, I am a witness that when God responds to prayer, He uses our voices and our hands. And perhaps raising the minimum wage somehow allows people to see God's response to those who do not have enough food to feed their families, but still lift up the Lord's Prayer, saying, give us this day our daily bread. Raising the minimum wage is an opportunity for our leaders to be prophetic in meeting the needs of the poor and not pathetic in padding the pockets of the powerful. Jesus said that inasmuch as you respond to the needs of the least of these, that you are doing it unto me. In other words, He was and still is calling for us to do, in the words of Dr. Aubrey Hendricks Jr., treat the needs of the people as holy. And that's what we are asking our senators to do. We are not asking you to give us crumbs from a table that we built. We are not asking for a handout. We are not asking for charity. We are not asking for a favor. But we are asking you to somehow humble yourselves, rise above partisan politics. We are asking you to rise above selfishness and hidden agendas. We are asking you to rise to the calling of the post that you have been assigned. Raise the minimum wage and treat the needs of the people as holy.
There we go.